Everybody has a story, and that means you. And everybody's story matters immensely, and yours does right this day. But nobody gets the story they want, and this is the great crisis that can, if we let it, lead us to God in ways that are deeper than we often understand. So I want to walk there today with you by talking with you some about the story of the Christian writer, thinker, Oxford and Cambridge professor C.S. Lewis. And I want to talk about grief today and what he says and writes about it. So if you have never experienced grief in your life and you're planning on not having any grief going forward, just a grief-free life and a grief-free death, you can just turn it off right now. But otherwise, you come along. C.S. Lewis was familiar with grief when he was quite young. He called himself Jaxie when he was a kid after the family dog. And if you have read much or seen much about him, you might know that people would sometimes call him Jack. The CS stood for Clive Staple Lewis, but Jack's a little bit less stuffy. Jaxie. He writes in one version of his story called Surprised by Joy about when his mom had died. He's 9 years old. He said, "I was taken into the bedroom where my mother lay dead, as they said, to see her. In reality, so I knew at once, to see it. There was nothing that a grown-up would call disfigurement except for the total disfigurement, which is death itself. Grief was overwhelmed in terror." And he will write much later that nobody had told him how much grief was like fear. He was an absolutely brilliant mind. He was a prodigy when he was still very young. By the time he was 10 years old, he had read and enjoyed Paradise Lost by Milton. He told his father that he had a prejudice against the French, and his father said, "Why do you have a prejudice against the French?" And Lewis said, "If I could answer that question, it wouldn't be a prejudice, would it?" And his appetite for reason and rational debate was keen to the point of aggression. He wrote many books which have been helpful for many folks. He himself was an atheist from when he was fairly young growing up, and then it was really reading and thinking and reflection that brought him to believe, first, that there must be a personal God behind our universe, and then that the God described in the Bible and proclaimed by Jesus is in fact who their God is. This is from Richard Lisher's book, Our Hearts Are Restless, in the chapter about C.S. Lewis. About Lewis, one has to say, the man is full of surprises. Chief among them is a consuming passion for a woman, and a particular sort of woman at that. Joy Gresham was in her late 30s when they met. Some of Lewis's friends thought that his memoir, Surprised by Joy, because it was written before they got married, but after he had met her, was actually kind of a joke. Joy is a great theme in the book, but that was also referring to this woman, Joy, that he was surprised by. So they thought it was a joke. It's not enough to make you laugh, but they enjoyed it. She was divorced, mother of 2 boys. Jack, as he was known to his friends and family, was already in his mid-50s, almost certainly virginal, and as uncomfortable with children as he was with women. She was New York aggressive, not the ideal type for a man whose private life was as ordinary as his imagination was fantastical. She was the pursuer, he was the pursued. They were strictly friends. Initially, they got married in a civil ceremony so that her boys could attend school in England. After her cancer diagnosis, their marriage was blessed by the church in her hospital room. And it was only after that that the friendship blossomed into romance and love and sexual intimacy for just a brief time until her life was cut short by cancer and she was only 45. And then Lewis wrote a book. He had 5 journals with him that would allow about 3,500 words each, and he filled them up, and he called the book A Grief Observed. And it is rather shockingly raw if you ever read through it. Lisher goes on to write, another surprise from Lewis is the blasphemy. In The Problem of Pain, written 20 years earlier, Lewis characterizes human pain as God's megaphone, a blast of the divine will in response to our perennial deafness to it. For Lewis, our souls are made perfect through suffering. The Problem of Pain and A Grief Observed, which is written after Joy dies, appear to have been written by different authors. One, a religious apologist in his university study, the other, a widower in an empty house filled with memories. Theodicy is the attempt to explain or solve the problem of evil. How can God be good and all-powerful and there be so much suffering in the world? Theodicy perennially founders on the shoals of personal tragedy, not because its intellectual tenets are faulty, but because our hearts have different requirements. The philosopher Nicholas Walterstorff, and we've talked about him before in his remarkable book, Lament for a Son. Reflecting on the death of his son, Walterstorff writes, I think I might have been interested in the problem of evil had Eric not died. The death of his son meant he could no longer simply look at this as an abstract philosophical problem to be solved. Like C.S. Lewis, evangelical apologist William Abraham frequently argued for God's providence, but when his son died, he admits in Among the Ashes he could not make it out. Lewis goes farther and harder. For him, the great question is not, is there a God, but what kind of God? He calls God the great vivisector. Sounds like Job charging God with shooting poisonous arrows at him. A scientist who inflicts pain on helpless creatures in the interest of a higher good. What if the theologians are right and God is a good vivisectionist or a good surgeon who only cuts for our benefit? He keeps on cutting, doesn't he? Lewis confesses how hard it is not to say, God forgive God. Not God forgive me or God forgive her. God forgive God. He characterizes God as a door slammed in your face and a sound of bolting and double bolting on the inside. This is a different tack than the one he follows in Surprised by Joy, where his imaginative world and philosophical commitments dovetail nicely with his acceptance of theism. When that happens, everything comes together with the famous click of certainty. Click. A very different word than bolt. The real shock came after C.S. Lewis died. This book, A Grief Observed, was published just briefly before he died, but because it was so incredibly raw, it was actually published under the name N.W. Clerk, and it was not until after Lewis died that the cover was changed and it was known that C.S. Lewis wrote the book. And among many of his admirers, it felt so raw, like it pushed the edges so much that they were really troubled by it. But there are other readers, Richard Lisher, who wrote this book, who suffered the death of his own son, says that he is one of them who admire Lewis precisely because of A Grief Observed. And I want to say a word about the title. For you who grieve, or think you might, or know someone who will. The book is not called A Grief Managed, or A Grief Explained, or A Grief Resolved, or A Grief Recovered from. It is simply A Grief Observed. Because at its deepest level, it cannot be explained. And when there is somebody that we love or some loss that is great, sometimes in this world, it cannot be replaced. It cannot be. It can only be observed. And somehow being observed with God has a power to it. That's why Paul says that we are to mourn with those who mourn. He doesn't say explain their mourning. He doesn't say help them to recover from it. He doesn't say fix it. Just somehow when we stand with people in mourning or when we stand before God in our own, It's an interesting thing. Often in many contemporary churches in the West and the U.S., people will gather and sing what are typically called praise choruses. There's not like a lot of grief choruses that get written, grief songs that get written. There have been, of course, in the African American church. And it's very striking. Words like, "Were you there when they crucified my Lord?" To know Jesus as the one who suffered and who suffers alongside and with our suffering has a kind of power to it that an explanation cannot bring. Frederick Douglass, the great orator and Christian and prophet of emancipation in the 19th century, said, "A keen observer will note when listening to many spirituals from the Black tradition that they have meaning on multiple levels. Swing low, sweet chariot, coming for to carry me home," or talk about Canaan land. He said, when those songs were sung, we were thinking not just about heaven, that too, but we were thinking about the north. And how ironic it is that when this book in the Bible was given by slave owners to enslaved persons, it was thought that that would help to subdue them, but instead it told them a story of the people of God who were liberated from oppression in slavery. It became a story of elevation and liberation and freedom. So now, today, if you know somebody who is grieving, grieve with them. I think of somebody I know who these little days right here are just difficult days because they're marked by a series of losses. And something happens when we grieve with one another here in the fellowship of the withered hand. And if you are grieving today, don't try to make it go away. Don't try to explain it. Observe it. Bring it to Him. He is forever the man of sorrows, acquainted with grief, acquainted with grief. For some strange reason that I don't fully understand, we meet Him in grief, in pain, in ways that we don't meet Him anyplace else. This is just simply true. May it be true for you. This is my story.
Hey, if you enjoyed that video, be sure to subscribe to our YouTube channel so you don't miss any future teachings from John Ortberg here at Become New. My name's Tim, and I'm a part of the team here. This series is all about stories. Everybody has a story, and everybody's story matters. And we want to know about your story, whether it's a story of coming to faith or a story of spiritual growth. Whatever it is, we're here for you. You can email that to us at connect@becomenew.com, or you can text it to us. You can also sign up for daily reminders whenever we drop a new video via text by texting the word BECOME to the number 855-888-0444. You can also send us prayer requests there. There's a team of us that meet to pray each weekday for viewers just like yourself. If you'd like to receive the emails that go along with each video, be sure to check that out at becomenew.com/subscribe. More than a video to watch, this is really a community to belong to, and we're so glad that you're a part of it. We'll catch you next time.